And thanks so much for being with us now as Alex Murdaugh, the convicted double murderer, is attempting to get a new trial on those murder convictions. We're going to talk about that because that court case is fast approaching. In fact, there's something happening in court tomorrow. Our guests are Luke and Brian Sheely, criminal defense attorneys here in the Columbia area. Guys, thank you as always for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
So let's talk about what is exactly happening here. We know that there's been some allegations of jury tampering by the clerk of court. And next week, and we'll get to tomorrow, but next week is when this is going to begin in earnest, where I guess defense attorneys have to make some sort of case, right?
That's right. The burden is on them. Mr. Murdaugh's team back in the fall filed a motion for a new trial based on after discovered evidence concerning clerk of court Hill. That motion, at least to have the hearing, was granted, and so it's going to be an evidentiary hearing where they've got the burden, and it will be seemingly consisting of putting up jurors to be questioned by Judge Toll, and then maybe even Becky Hill, and see if they can meet their burden.
Do you think they're going to meet that burden?
I don't think so. I think given the status conference, the way Justice Toll kind of outlined, her perception of the law, and she's the gatekeeper of the law, I think it's gonna be really difficult. And I know Luke and I have been chatting a lot about this and the various cases that she could have implemented, but the way she's going with her interpretation of what the state, has to essentially prevent to keep the verdict is gonna be difficult for the defense team. And I know, Luke, you had kind of read that case and had some thoughts about Jean Toll's decision on this matter, but I mean, it's going to be difficult. And, this is going to be not a free-flowing cross-examination of any and all jurors. As Chief Justice Toll said, it's going to be very limited inquiry. Mm-hmm. And really, she'll be doing the questioning. And then if Becky Hill chooses to testify, then I think there'll be more of a thorough examination of her. But these jurors, it's going to be very succinct, to the point. And Chief Justice Toll will get an opportunity to ask them that and see what they say.
All right, so Becky Hill is the clerk of court. Luke, what exactly are defense attorneys alleging happened here as the jury was deliberating this case?
Well, in their brief, they filed several affidavits where jurors are essentially saying that Becky Hill was having private conversations with them, particularly cueing in on the foreperson, telling them to disbelieve Mr. Murdaugh himself, to not believe certain defense experts. And then the most kind of salacious thing is that there's an allegation that she engineered conflict for one of the jurors based on a Facebook post that ultimately got her excused. So that's kind of the way they've set the table. And it's really, if the allegations are true, it's unheard of, it's terrible, it violates the sanctity of the province of the jury. But the state's basically saying it's not true, and or even if any of it is true, it wouldn't have changed the verdict anyway. It's their basic position.
I know the case is supposed to begin in earnest Monday, but there is a court hearing in this case tomorrow. What's going on?
Yeah, JR, there's one juror that has a conflict with next week, and so this juror is going to be allowed to start essentially the inquiry tomorrow. And so This will be no cameras present. My understanding is that reporters will be allowed, but no cameras. And Jean Toll will be allowed to, start the process and get going. So that'll be kind of an appetizer for the main course next week. But it will give, I think, interestingly, both sides an opportunity to see how Justice Toll will allow the flow of this experience. We'll get to maybe determine which of these lawyers is representing this juror. I believe it's Eric Bland, and it'll be a good kind of primer for next week.
Let's talk about the key players in this now. Alex Murdaugh, of course, as you know, convicted of killing his son and his daughter, serving a double life sentence, even if he gets a new trial here. And even if for some reason a jury comes back and says not guilty, Alex Murdaugh is probably never going to get out of prison, is he?
Probably not. I mean, it's interesting because there was a huge legal ruling in his trial where Judge Newman allowed the financial crimes to come into play to show kind of his desperation and why he might have committed such crazy, heinous acts. And so that was a huge legal ruling where then he was forced to kind of embrace those crimes and say, I'm sorry, my bad, but I'm not a murderer. So I guess hypothetically, if you get a complete redo based on misconduct by Clerk of Court Hill, then maybe you say, well, look, I wouldn't have had to, confess to those crimes, which ultimately caused me to have to plead guilty, but for the Judge Newman's, let's say, incorrect ruling. So I don't know. I mean, he's got good lawyers. Nothing's impossible, but you would think that he's serving a massive sentence already on the financial crimes, that there may be no hope. It might just be principle for him.
You say he's got good lawyers. That leads us to other key players in the case. Dick Harpootlian, who was one of the defense attorneys in the case last year, former solicitor. He was a criminal defense attorney. He was a Democratic state senator, along with Jim Griffin. He's also one of the defense attorneys here. He's a trial and health care lawyer, a former assistant U.S. attorney. He runs a private practice. He worked as an assistant United States attorney for the state for some 2 years, I believe. So again, this is the defense team: Dick Harpootlian, Jim Griffin, people who followed the trial last year, January, February, and March. They've seen him in action. And so here we go again, back in court once more for Alex Murdaugh. Do you think this is the last hurrah as far as trying to get him a new trial?
I don't. I mean, the thing about Harpootlian, and I'll just speak to Harpootlian, is that he's never really done. And this whole proceeding is kind of an example of his, inquiry after the guilty verdicts, and he was, sending out questionnaires and interviewing jurors, and then a very standard thing like interviewing jurors after a guilty verdict. Defense lawyers do it all the time, especially on serious cases. Kind of unraveled into the Becky Hill analysis, and then that turned into these emails being produced where there's a lot of improper things. I mean, it's, Luke and I will always say about Dick Harpootlian, and people either love him or hate him. There's no real middle ground. You're not lukewarm on Dick Harpootlian, and he's fine with that. He likes it that way. But the thing about Dick Harpootlian is, don't have any dirt on you. If you're going to cross swords with Dick Harpootlian, be squeaky clean. And whether Miss Hill did influence this jury in some way or whether she didn't, the emails certainly show at a bare minimum that she was forwarding messages from interested parties to law enforcement and Creighton Waters during the trial. I mean, Luke and I, we did 11 jury trials last year. We've done tons of jury trials on major matters. We get furious if our jurors are not being given dinner at an appropriate time. We like them to be very comfortable. And so when this allegation against Miss Hill first came out, we were just flabbergasted, honestly. It is unheard of. This is kind of brand new territory for everybody. And so it's quite interesting. But to answer your question, there will be an appeal either way at the end of this evidentiary hearing.
You mentioned Creighton Waters a moment ago. He's back in court again. He prosecuted the case the first go around. Chief attorney for the state grand jury. He has worked 25 years, I believe, as far as cases go with the state attorney general's office. Creighton Waters, what kind of challenge does he have going into court again with this same case?
Well, he's unhappy being in this position. He's gotten, obviously, a ruling from Justice Toll, who's basically inclined to set the rule in the way that he argued in his brief, that the defense will need to show some prejudice that would have changed the outcome. But we joked around on our podcast the other day. He had this long, hard-fought conviction that he's very proud of, basically been made a celebrity, and, rightly so. He's done a great job. And then it's almost like he's a football player who's caught this amazing cat pass. He's running towards the end zone, and then Becky Hill's like this gopher that pops out of the ground and like trips him, and he fumbles the ball on the 1 yard line. So he got there, and all of a sudden he has this unforced error that's really just probably he's not happy about. So, but he's going to do his thing and try to establish that even though maybe there's some other communication that's unusual, that this is your verdict, it's still your verdict. You weighed the evidence, you did your job, you upheld your oath, and that's what he's going to want to see throughout these few days of this hearing.
All right, Judge Newman is not going to be the judge in this case this go around. Instead, this goes to the former Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court, Justice Jean Toll, who would probably be rather playing golf than having to deal with something like this. Avid golfer that she once was anyway. First woman to serve as a justice of the state Supreme Court, serving 27 years on the High Court, practicing law for 20 years before the state Supreme Court in both plaintiff and defense work. She retired back in 2015, but appointed to oversee this all-important Murdaugh hearing. She's tough as nails, but fair, right?
That's right. Tough as nails. She's not going to put up with any kind of grandstanding or kind of second bites of the apple once she's made her ruling. I appeared in front of her once as a Supreme Court justice on an argument, and she chewed me up and spit me out. So it's not going to be easy, but she pretty much staked her claim and said that this decision will be based on what she perceives the ruling in State v. Green, which is what the Creighton Waters is advocating. It's not what the defense team is advocating. So we'll see how that plays out.
Talk about the jury for just a moment. Those jury members that convicted Alex Murdaugh back in March of last year, will they be a part of this next week?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
But they're going to have to, will they be called one by one?
Yes.
To offer some sort of testimony?
They are going to be, at the status conference with Jean Toll, was setting the ground rules. She will be asking them the questions. So it won't be a free-flowing cross-examination by the state and the defense team. It's going to be former Chief Justice Toll getting to the bottom of it, right. Individually with each of them, and then if Becky Hill chooses to testify, that'll be a more open discussion between the parties, and that will probably be a very long thing. But
the one juror who will not take part in this is the one that was removed, the so-called egg juror.
Right.
And I know the defense took a lot of exception to that because they said, well, but for impropriety by Ms. Hill, she would have been a part of the jury. So, but Justice Toll has made her ruling. She says, I'm only going to consider jurors that actually deliberated.
Well, technically, she said at this time, this is my ruling. Maybe you'll change my mind.
Maybe.
But she laid a very straightforward path to how she wants to conduct this evidentiary hearing.
Let's talk about what role Eric Bland is going to play in this next week. He's a local attorney. Joe McCullough, also a local attorney who suffered a heart attack earlier this week. Not sure if he's going to be able to be in court next week. Tell me about their role in all of this.
Well, it's never good when lawyers have lawyers, or particularly when jurors have lawyers. But this thing is so entrenched that everybody needs their rights protected. And on something like this with so much publicity, it does make sense to have lawyers protecting the identities of jurors to make sure they're not being harassed. But sometimes you get the sense that they're just protecting the outcome. But Mr. Bland represents several, and he's been very outspoken and wants to make sure that they're heard and they're protected. And you mentioned Joe McCullough. I know he at least represents one, and he did have a heart attack. I hear he's doing better, right. And that I don't know if he'll be taking part in this next week or not. But if I know Joe, he'll probably try for sure if he's able.
Yeah. Of course, one of the key players at the center of all of this is the Colleton County Clerk of Court. That would be Becky Hill, who is accused of tampering with the jury. She wrote that book, Behind the Doors of Justice. But since then, since all of this happened, she's admitted to plagiarizing some of the content in that book. So here's a woman who says, I did wrong, but now she's trying to say I did right when it comes to this case. How is the book issue, the plagiarism, is that going to impact this case at all when it comes to her believability?
Yes. If she chooses to testify, her credibility is at stake. And that's at this point an admitted lie on her part. And so the line of examination will be, well, if you lie about stuff like this, then how can we believe you now? And by the way, the book, which you lied about authoring parts of it, you plagiarized parts of it, That's your whole motivation. So you're willing to lie for money, you're willing to influence for money, and that will be the line of examination for the defense team. And I tell you, JR, Luke and I, if we represented Becky Hill, even though the state, I'm sure, wants her to say, listen, I didn't say anything, out of turn with these jurors. It's just sour grapes by the defense team. But Miss Hill is under at least 2 different investigations by SLED.
Mm-hmm.
She also could be under a federal investigation. She's got an excellent group of lawyers, especially Will Lewis, who has a lot of experience in white-collar prosecution and defense. We would never let her testify in this proceeding.
You mentioned Will Lewis, but he is being joined by Justin Bamberg,
Sure.
who's got quite a reputation out there already as a lawmaker and an attorney in court.
Yeah, great advocate, great spokesman, certainly is a great lawyer. So she's picked 2 good ones that have different skill sets. And if we were those guys and she were our client, we would say, let this play on, but you're not going to take a part under oath because you got a lot at stake. So it's going to be fascinating when the defense calls her, whether she invokes.
All right, so we have this testimony tomorrow from a witness who has a conflict next week. This thing is scheduled for what, 3 days next week? Mm-hmm. A possibility it could go shorter or longer?
Sure, either way.
Possibility. I have an idea that Justice Toll will keep it on track.
Alex Murdaugh, I'm assuming he will be in court for this next week. Do you have any idea? Is he going to be transported back and forth from where he's being held down in the Low Country to the courtroom here in Columbia?
It could be, but it might make arrangements for him to stay locally just for convenience sake. But it's up to the Department of Corrections, and Justice Toll can make an order on that quite easily that he can stay at Alvin S. Glenn if it's more convenient.
Are we expecting to hear from Alex Murdaugh himself through all of this?
No. He doesn't have any burden, and he's not a witness. He's an interested party because he wants his new trial, but there's nothing really for him to say. But he definitely wants to be there and see it all unfold.
All right. So you guys, you're the attorneys presenting this in front of Justice Toll. You're the guys trying to get a new trial. What do you say to Judge Toll next week?
As a judge, this is highly inappropriate. This is an elected official. Respectfully, the standard you set forth is wrong. The standard in Cameron is correct. This is not an elected official asking about what their lunch orders are. These jurors will testify before you that she was, behind closed doors telling them to disbelieve the defense. At best, that's all she's saying. To help the other side disbelieve the defense. If that happens in any country in our land, in our state, in our counties, it's a structural error. So I'd be saying that to the judge and say, as bad as he may be, we cannot let this stand. The right to a fair trial is so much more important than whether he gets a redo.
Right. You guys, what's your gut telling you about all this?
Good judges will, lay out the law. Good judges also, when they lay out the law, are open to changes in a proceeding. If a juror says something that opens an inquiry, and so Justice Toll laid down the law, but she also kind of had a little crack there about maybe at this point, here's how it's going to be, but maybe I am persuaded differently based on witness testimony. Again, this is an evidentiary proceeding. It's not, a lawyer argument. I mean, there will be that, but it's all about the evidence. So if she sticks to her ruling on her interpretation of what must be shown by the defense, actual prejudice, I don't think he's going to get anything granted here. But if she hears more, and if the Becky Hill situation actually develops into real testimony and there's a vigorous cross-examination, that could get interesting. And if she changes any bit her interpretation of the law, or doing something like letting the egg-wit juror testify, that may open a light for Alex Murdaugh. But I would say this is done based on her status conference.
You agree?
I do. I don't want to say that, and I'm open. I hope that it's a very open law applied to facts analysis, but I was a little bit surprised by her rulings regarding the law and the standard. So we'll see. we'll see. But I think if I had to bet right now, I'd say he does not get granted a new trial, and it goes up, and it's just part of his other appellate issues.
Right. So again, if that's the case, you guys expect that to be appealed, and here we
Oh
go.
yeah, it'd
Yes.
just be
all
another
over
appellate
Yes.
issue.
again. All right. Brian, Luke, Sheely, guys, as always, thank you very much. You guys are going to be with us next week, I believe,
That's right.
as we'll discuss the activities that go on in the courtroom as the double murderer, Alex Murdaugh, attempts to show tampering with the jury by the Colleton County Clerk of Court, trying to get a new trial for the deaths of his wife and his son. And we'll be talking about it next week at 8 o'clock right here, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, the Alex Murdaugh case. Thank you so very much for tuning in.